Welcome. It's my privilege as a member of STARRS to be one of the presenters today. My co-presenter is Major General Joe Arbuckle. General Arbuckle is a Vietnam veteran, served over 30 years on active duty, and he served in very key strategy positions at the higher levels of the Army towards the end of his career. I've been a former professor, and now I have the honor of being the president and CEO of STARRS. So we have today is a presentation that we put together and are presenting it across the nation. It's the American Creed Threatened by Radical Indoctrination. It has three components. The first talks about our American Creed and why it is important for us to preserve it. I'll talk about the threat, and then General Arbuckle will wrap it up with a segment on what we can and should be doing about it. So with that, General Arbuckle, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Ron. I'm not sure what to call you, Colonel Scott, Dr. Scott, or Professor, but I'm just going to go with Ron. You're my friend. All right, talk about the basis of the American Creed. Where is it found? This slide answers that question. Of course, it's in our founding documents, beginning with our Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, followed by our Constitution. And most people don't recall or realize it took about 11 years of discussion and debate, sometimes heated debate, after the Declaration before our Constitution was finally ratified, 1787. And then it took about another 4 years of debate before the signers settled on our Bill of Rights, which became, as we know, the first 10 amendments in our Constitution. Next slide, please. So what is the American Creed? If you look at our Declaration of Independence, these words pretty much define it in a very short, succinct manner. It says all Americans are created equal, endowed by their Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some key words in there. Most importantly is Creator. Our founding documents are different than other founding documents, other countries across the world, in that we recognize that our rights come from our Creator, they come from God, not man. That's a key distinction that carries through in the Creed. Next slide, please. We the people, coming right from our Constitution, if you had to pick three words, I believe, that are most important when you talk about our Creed, it is we the people. Recognize that the rights of our government, the power from our government comes from the people. It's not the other way around. And those rights are inalienable. All right, let's go to the next chart, please. The sources of the Creed are found in our Judeo-Christian heritage. In God we trust. Our framers, our founders were largely, for the most part, in fact, the vast majority, very, very religious men, and they incorporated their religious beliefs into our founding documents with our laws, our morals, our ethics. And we're going to take a look at an oath, which displays what this is all about for our military members. Let's go to the next chart, please. This is the commissioned officer's oath, but it's very similar to other oaths that all members of the military must take. There's slight variations among those non-commissioned officers' oaths for those that are, first of all, enlisted in the military or re-enlisting. But there's a lot of common denominators that are shown in yellow on this particular chart. So let's take a look at those. Begins with, I do solemnly swear, and ends with, so help me God. Now that's an oath to God, and that's not something we should take lightly for those of us who are religious, because we're going to be held accountable for it. And frankly, myself, Colonel Scott, and all the volunteer members of STARRS are doing this because that oath never ends. There's no termination date on it. We're still engaged in what we said that we would support and defend in this oath. And what is that? It's the Constitution of the United States. We do not swear to support and defend the president or any member of Congress, but rather it's the Constitution. And as we've already established, the Constitution is best represented by those three words, we the people. So in effect, when we swear this oath, we are swearing to support and defend the people of the United States as embodied in our Constitution. Now, against what? Against foreign and domestic enemies. You know, in my 32 years in active duty, I was always focused on the foreign threat. I never gave much thought to the domestic enemy. But about 15 years ago, after retirement, I started thinking about that and looking around at what was happening to our country, and came to the conclusion that more and more our greatest threat to survival as a constitutional republic has become domestic or internal. So let's go into that in a little bit more detail in the next slide, please. This is a really important slide, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. As you see, the title addresses just what I said on the previous chart: foreign and domestic enemies, and they're shown on this chart with the left side being the foreign and the right the domestic. The key takeaway from this chart, this slide, is that we are at war right now. This is not a shooting war, but nevertheless, it's just as dangerous as if it were. And in my opinion, we have been losing this war, and I'll define that, and you'll see that defined more as we go through this presentation. Let's start with foreign. Go back to about 500 BC in China. There was a great Chinese general, philosopher, and writer called Sun Tzu. He wrote a book called The Art of War, which is still being studied today in all our military schools or senior military schools across the United States and actually across the globe. His entire thesis through this book was that the best battles, the best wars that are won without firing a shot. Now, that's paraphrasing, obviously, but his point was if you can intimidate and coerce the enemy into submission to your will, that is the best way to win without having to engage in actual combat. Now, fast forward to 1999, as you see there, two Chinese communist colonels wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare, which is a spinoff of Sun Tzu. And in that, they identified several things as part of their basic battle plan on how to defeat the enemy. Well, who is the enemy? They're talking about the United States. So in effect, they've been at war with us since 1999, according to the doctrines in this particular book. And it deals with compelling the enemy to submit to their will without having to fire a shot, use the military less, the violence less, use political and technological techniques to defeat the enemy. And there is no limits to war. War is war in their view, and they will do anything to win, to include getting involved in intellectual property theft, which everybody's probably familiar with, infiltrating our colleges and universities, particularly our research and development labs, and then taking that technology back and using it against us. They've been buying a lot of farmland. About 300,000 acres of our farmland have been purchased by the Chinese. Tens of thousands of acres around our military installations have been purchased, and so on. And so basically, those are some of the techniques that they're using. We have learned here recently that up to 100,000 military-age Chinese have crossed our borders as part of the open border policy. Now, why are they here? Open-ended question. Let's shift over to domestic. A cultural war here in the United States began in the 1930s, and Ron will be talking about that following me, with some Marxists that came here from Germany. And then one of those guys founded basically the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, and it's really exploded ever since. The idea was to indoctrinate through our educational system, primarily students in the values of Marxism and socialism, and we see the fruits of that labor here all over our country today. They got into critical race theory, CRT, and diversity, equity, inclusion, which Ron will define. And if you want to see some evidence of that, just look at the students and faculty of some of our major colleges and universities leading riots, flying Hamas flags. The flag of a terrorist organization has sworn to defeat the United States and Israel, right? And they're doing it right here in our country. Meanwhile, they burn the American flag. How about the riots conducted by Antifa, BLM, Black Lives Matter, and the anti-Semitism that's rampart across our United States right now, and ICE agents being attacked in places like Portland, with Antifa engaged in that in a very organized way. In addition, right now, and this is kind of a major bellwether indicator, we have an avowed socialist, Muslim communist running for the mayor of New York City, our premier city, and it looks like he's going to win. Finally, the assassination of Charlie Kirk is evidence of this kind of a philosophy and the hate behind it. Up in the right-hand corner is Flag Officers for America, mentioned, I am the volunteer leader of that organization. Retired generals and admirals, and occasionally put out letters that are of interest and ask that group to sign. In the May of 2021, 222 retired generals and admirals signed an open letter. In that, I want to read from it. Our nation is in deep peril. We are in a fight for survival as a constitutional republic like no other time since our founding in 1776. The conflict is between the supporters of socialism and Marxism versus supporters of our constitutional freedoms and liberty. We went on to list about 12 national security threats in this letter and concluded with this point, which is of interest today. The mental and physical condition of the commander-in-chief cannot be ignored. He must be able to quickly make accurate national security decisions involving life and limb anywhere, day or night. Now, the condition of the president during those past 4 years has become evident. We pointed that out in 2021. Next slide, please. This slide is just simply a comparison of what we've been talking about on the left side, our American society, our creed, our founding documents, compared to the vision and ideology of the Marxist and socialist. The key point is at the bottom. A lot of people are throwing the terms around socialism and Marxism as if they're the same. They're not, however, are definitely related. Socialism is an economic system. It's at the opposite extreme of free market capitalism, where people can work as hard as they want based upon the freedoms we have, do whatever they want, and then profit from the fruits of their labor. Socialism, on the other hand, is a system of economics which makes people dependent upon the government. Now, nobody wants the government to be taking away the fruits of their labor, their hard work, and redistributing their wealth to somebody else. At least no normal person would. And so it takes a tyrannical or authoritarian type of government to combine with socialism to impose it on people and make it happen. So that's the relationship between the two. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Scott. He's going to talk about the ideological roots of Marxism, and then I'll come back after that. Back to you, Ron.
Great. Thanks, General. So the General just told you the good story here of what we have the opportunity of preserving. There is a tremendous threat against the American creed. And right now, we've narrowed that down to critical race theory. Now, as a little introduction to the material I will present, the General mentioned the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was a cohort of scholars from Germany. They were part of a social inquiry institute in Germany that was focused on integrating Marxism with psychoanalysis. When Hitler came to power, they realized that for their own safety and for the opportunity to spread their ideology, they needed to find a safe haven. That safe haven was Columbia University in New York in the 1930s. They set up residence and started advancing what was called critical theory, because Marxism was based on an economic model of the bourgeoisie who controlled the powers of production and the proletariat, the working class. And the whole idea was to incite a revolution to go beyond that via socialism to what they would call utopia, which would have been a communist state. So Adorno, Horkheimer, Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, which you'll hear about a little bit more here in a minute or so, were part of this Frankfurt School. So they advanced critical theory as an alternative way of promoting a revolution based on dividing classes of people. This became political identity groups. And one of their most lucrative targets was the Black population in America. So the radical indoctrination that we're talking about is based on this critical race theory, which evolved from critical theory. And before that, there was a critical legal theory, which right now maintains a presence in most of the law schools in America, where they talk about racial and social and economic injustice and that sort of thing. It is an indoctrination that shapes their view of the law and how it's applied. But they couldn't just advance the theory. They had to apply it in a different form. And that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion come into play. It's called a praxis, and it's the way they advanced it here within American institutions. So we're talking cultural Marxism as the root of critical race theory and DEI. But I have to add that the extra fuel that gave it traction in America is a concept or a phenomenon called postmodernism, and it originated in Western Europe. Postmodernism was all about deconstructing the truth and traditions that we had inherited from former generations. So this was the agitation part intellectually in making America and Western Europe vulnerable to these types of developments. So let me give you some examples here. Prior to our Civil War in America, 1843, Karl Marx sent a letter to Arnold Ruge, another intellectual, both of whom were in exile in France because they had been banned from Germany. In this letter, Marx talks about critical philosophy. And again, this was sort of the prelude to the postmodernism that we saw in other manifestations in intellectual thought in Europe. In this letter, he talked about the importance of obtaining forgiveness for its sins. Mankind needs only to declare them for what they are. So even though Marx was an atheist, secular humanist, he talked about his thinking in religious terms about how moral or immoral things were and how sinful certain forms of thought were. So 5 years later is when we became aware of the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. And among some of the key tenets that this manifesto promoted was the importance of abolishing personal property, the importance of the state educating children, not the parents, class warfare, the haves or have-nots. And here again, the Frankfurt School changed the economic contest to a political contest, and the importance of worldwide revolution. And it was around 1924 that Lenin was quoted saying, "Give me just one generation of youth and I'll transform the world." And we see that right now in America. We are one generation away of losing what we've known of as our constitutional republic. Another key figure in the historical development here in America is Woodrow Wilson, who was president in 1913 to 1921. Now, Wilson is known as the father of the administrative state led by unelected technocrats. So this is basically the genesis for the huge federal system that we have today, the unelected bureaucracy. Wilson lacked faith in a Republican self-government. He said that the people were selfish, ignorant, timid, stubborn, or foolish, persons whom the bulk of can actually vote. So he didn't trust them to really play out what we the people is all about in our Constitution. He saw the Constitution as a living document, but more importantly, the impact of his time as president was enough to establish the political and bureaucratic conditions for socialist developments under the New Deal and Lyndon Baines Johnson's The Great Society. Ironically, about this time, a Marxist in Italy by the name of Antonio Gramsci was writing about the importance of socialism. This thinking has infiltrated our K through 12 public schools, universities, the media, and the courts. Well, Gramsci didn't coin the term the long march through the institutions. It was his writing and inspiration that prompted Rudi Deutschke, a German radical, to coin that term, the long march through the institutions, based on Gramsci's writings. Mao Zedong was a student, and so was Herbert Marcuse. But this quote from Gramsci should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He said, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society." You'll hear that again here shortly. Herbert Marcuse. As I mentioned, he was a member of the Frankfurt School that came to America from Germany. He's considered the father of the New Left. And he was the one that really, to a great extent, fomented the radicalism and riots and student protests that we saw in the 1960s. He's published many books. He's probably the fuel that energized the feminist movement. But here's one of his quotes from one of his books. He said, "Liberating tolerance, then, would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left." In other words, We cannot tolerate different views from the right. And we see that playing out right now in American politics. These graphics were produced by Kendall Qualls, who stood up an organization in Minneapolis following the George Floyd riots. When he saw how animated people became because of the manufactured narratives evolving from that event, he wanted to emphasize to minorities that they can take charge of their lives. So in his efforts to message the importance of taking charge of our own lives, he did some search of LexisNexis to see how prominent certain terms were in the publications. And you can see the graph is pretty flat from the left, moving to the right, and then it shoots up to the right. So, what were the terms that now all of a sudden started to be amplified when Obama came to a second term? The upper left is systemic racism, upper right, unconscious bias, middle left, white privilege, middle right, white supremacy, bottom left, diversity and inclusion, and bottom right, whiteness. So the left was changing the language that Americans were using to understand and process what was going on in the world. But this is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence. In the fall of 2008, the Black Congressional Caucus inserted in the National Defense Authorization Act a provision for the Military Leadership Diversity Commission. They did this without any debate. And so this took place in the fall of 2008, just as President Obama was coming to a term in January of 2012. Here are some excerpts from page 18 of the final report that was issued in March of 2011. Diversity management calls for creating a culture of inclusion. Creating this culture will involve changing the way in which people relate to one another within a single unit, within a particular military branch, and throughout the DoD. So they were saying we're not free to choose for ourselves how we see things and how we relate to each other. They're going to basically manage how that's going to take place. They go on to say, in particular, although good diversity management rests on a foundation of fair treatment, it is not about treating everyone the same. This is where the word equity comes into play. This can be a difficult concept to grasp, especially for leaders who grew up with the equal opportunity inspired mandate to be both color and gender blind. Again, this relates to the the consciousness of society that Gramsci was talking about. We have to shape it. We have to let people know what's morally right or not. And then they wrap it up by saying blindness to difference, however, can lead to a culture of assimilation in which differences are suppressed rather than leveraged. In other words, assimilation is bad. We can't have a melting pot where everybody comes to embrace the same values that call themselves Americans. 5 months after that report was published in August of 2011, President Obama issued an executive order establishing funded personnel and programs across the entire federal government. That's where he had instantiated it within the federal government, one of the most critical institutions in America. When Trump came into power, he issued an executive order rescinding that. And then when Biden came into office, he rescinded Trump's executive orders and issued 3 more, all promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now that Trump is in power, he's issued even more executive orders doing away with diversity and inclusion, promoting meritocracy and equality. The key here is that we see executive order ping pong. And so that's where we need to bring Congress into play to codify what needs to be done to make sure that this consciousness in America has not been hijacked by the left. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague to bring it home. General, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. This is a great background and lesson there. Next slide, please. This slide is going to be busy. I should mention that there's no way that those listening to this can read everything on these slides. So I would invite you to go to our website. It's starrs.us, STARR, 2 R's. And there you can see the entire briefing, which in its total is about over an hour long. You're only seeing a fraction of it here during our short time with you. Now, this chart was developed about a year ago as a result of people asking us to show the connection between DEI and Marxist roots and our military readiness. And it looks busy. It's really a storyboard. It kind of reads easily, starting at the upper left with Marx and the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and down to the right-hand corner with readiness impacts. I'm just going to talk our way through that and hit some of the bullets in here that Ron has already covered. You know, the whole purpose of Marxism is to create division. And if you want one word that describes DEI, it's divisive. They want to divide people into groups and pit them against each other. And we heard originally back in Marx's day, it was based on economic reasons. But more recently, under the Cultural Revolution, it's based upon race, where whites are being called fundamentally racist. Our nation is fundamentally racist. The blacks and other minorities are being oppressed by the whites. Therefore, that oppression leads to a victimhood mentality for those being oppressed, which then logically extends into special privileges for the victims. Now, how does that manifest itself within the military? Well, with such things as for years, many, many years, the admission standards at our service academies like West Point and so on have been reduced for black admissions. And in addition, goals, what were called goals, have been set over the years for things like promotion boards, where people being selected to be promoted, key assignments like command, key schools, military schooling, where people are selected. Goals are established for certain minorities in terms of percentages to be selected for those rather than being based on meritocracy or merit. And of course, meritocracy has been the tried and true basis of our military for decades. Now, why is this harmful? Well, in addition to creating distrust and so forth, the best are not always selected for these key things, these key jobs, leadership positions, and so forth. In addition, then, we get into the word equity, which Ron mentioned a little bit ago, and that equity is based upon the philosophy that we need to have a common outcome. In other words, we need to lower standards so that almost all people can pass or more people can pass. A simple example is a physical fitness test. Standards lower for certain identity groups based on skin color, gender, whatever, can pass the test. Anytime you lower standards, you're going to automatically lower performance. And when performance is lowered, then that has a negative impact on readiness. So that's a connection between all these things in military readiness. In addition, DEI flies right in the face of our warrior ethos and the one team, one fight battle model, where everybody on the team is focused on a common mission and a common purpose. Loyalty is to the team rather than being to an identity group based on, again, skin color, gender, whatever it may be. And the team has to have total trust and confidence in each other for the very lives. And so that's roughly the connection between Marx, the idea, the philosophy to divide people, where the military is all about uniting people into one team and one mission and supporting each other. Next slide, please. Two parts of this particular slide. Let's start with the death toll of communism. Those people in New York City and other places in our country who are supporting socialism and Marxism have not done their research and looked at history, because history will tell you that the result of those two things, socialism and Marxism, is always the same. It's massive death and destruction. Just do a Google search or a web search and look up how many people were killed by Stalin in Russia, Mao in China, and Pol Pot in Cambodia. And you'll find different numbers, but it's going to be somewhere around 100 million people. Those people were killed. Those were their own people that they killed in concentration camps, death camps, starvation, or outright murder. That's the end result of socialism and communism. Now, taking that back on a more personal level, Ron mentioned I served as an infantry lieutenant in Vietnam. I've seen the ugly face of communism up close and personal. And we've had a lot of brave, loyal Americans killed fighting against communism over the years. 22 years during the Cold War. And then, of course, in Korea, about 37,000 were killed by Chinese communists and North Korean communists. In Vietnam, North Vietnamese, the communist Viet Cong. So you put those two together, and over 95,000 people, troops, have been killed by that ideology. And here's the kicker. That socialist Marxist ideology is controlling much of what's going on in our country today, not only in colleges and universities, but also in one of our major political systems and political parties. And so that illustrates the point that the enemy now is within. The enemy has become domestic. The enemy is socialism and Marxism. Next slide, please. I would urge you to get on the internet and do a search for the 45 communist goals that were read into the congressional record in 1963 by a congressman named Herlong. Again, there's 45. This busy chart only lists some of those. Go through them really quickly and ask you to think about how successful the communists have been since 1930 in implementing their goals. Here we go. Capture political parties, get control of schools and teacher unions, infiltrate the press and media, eliminate prayer and religion in schools, discredit our Constitution, call it inadequate, and discredit our founding fathers, belittle American culture, discourage teaching of American history, infiltrate and gain control of unions and big corporations, promote the United Nations and one world government, use student riots to foment public unrest. How about Portland right now? Infiltrate churches, discredit the Bible, discredit the family as an institution, and put the state more in charge of the family. Support violence and insurrection as legitimate using special interest groups like Antifa, BLM, and so forth. Break down standards of morality. The trans movement is a good example, and so on and so forth. So again, please take a look at that yourself. It's rather shocking. Next slide, please. In STARRS, we've had from the beginning 2 strategic goals that are shown up here. First was to eradicate DEI from our Department of Defense, now Department of War, and to a large degree that has happened on the surface. But in addition, we need to replace it with something that we've had all along, and that is equal opportunity for everybody in the military, and have a system, a personnel management system based upon meritocracy, not based upon identity groups. We've also focused on our second goal of getting rid of the illegal. Many of you may not know that the COVID vaccination, the way it was mandated, is illegal. We want to get rid of that out of our military. We worked hard with Congress and provide them some legislation, which they eventually put into the National Defense Authorization Act and mandated that it be removed, no longer required. However, many thousands of people, service members, have been harmed by that policy. Not only physically, but also career-wise. Tens of thousands have left voluntarily. Over 8,000 have been kicked out. And so we're seeking remedies for those people that have been harmed. To include, we're writing a letter to President Trump recommending that he grant a pardon or amnesty to those who receive less than an honorable discharge simply because they refused to take the illegal COVID vaccination or stood against DEI policies which were discriminatory. And so we've not heard back on that yet. We're still working that. In addition, we sent a letter to the Secretary of the VA, Doug Collins, asking that he include any veteran who has been harmed physically by the COVID vaccination to be included under this PACT Act, so they're entitled to veterans care for the common symptoms like myocarditis, blood clots, hardening of the arteries, strokes, and that sort of thing. How do we do this within STARRS? Well, we work 3 avenues of approach. Education, that's what we're doing right now on this particular podcast. We do this in many, many different forms and fashions. We propose legislation to members of Congress and their staffs, asking them to consider putting it into the National Defense Authorization Act, as we did with COVID. And we pursue different legal actions, such as freedom of information requests. We also are involved in some lawsuits and basically supporting individual service members who have been harmed by the COVID vaccination policy and DEI on a case-by-case basis. So we work all 3 approach that way in harmony to accomplish our 2 strategic goals. Next chart, please. What can you do? Well, on the left side, the first thing to recognize is the old adage about freedom not being free is absolutely true. The natural state of mankind, we would like to think, is freedom and peace, but it's not. It's oppression. And as soon as freedom is not protected, those with oppressive attitudes automatically move in and start to take over. And we see that happening in our country. Ronald Reagan summed that up, and he said, freedom's only 1 generation away from extinction. He was absolutely right. On the right-hand side is a document that came out of Flag Officers for America. Citizens ask us, well, okay, we got your message. What can we do to help? And so we produced this Citizens Action Plan, which is again on our STARRS website. And the whole idea is to get you citizens, all citizens, involved at the grassroots level and focus on, as you see at the top, our education system. We have to take control back of our schools. Get involved in the election of your school boards, attend the meetings and so forth, and present your case. The next thing is political. Get involved with local politics. Run for office if you can. If not, support other people who are doing that, who share our traditional American values. On the right-hand side, support your law enforcement. Make sure we elect sheriffs and district attorneys who will fairly and consistently enforce the law according to our Constitution. Get involved with the news media. And finally, organize around churches is one thing that we are pushing in this particular letter. But any other organization you want to organize around is great to accomplish the goals that are on this. Again, I'm just touching the surface. There's not time to dig into it anymore, but those are the tenets of this. Next slide, please. Action items. What can you do? Well, please sign up for our STARRS mailing list by going onto our website. There's no obligation. It's absolutely free. And with that, twice a month, you'll get a great newsletter distributed to you. And plus, you can just, surf around our website. There's a ton of great information on there. And we are a 501c3, so we do have some overhead operating expenses, even though the vast majority of us are all volunteers. So we do appreciate donations. That's a quick overview of this Creed briefing. We hope you enjoyed it, and please get on our website to see it in more detail. Thank you.